So I'm George Gann. I'm the Chief Conservation Strategist, among other roles, at the Institute for Regional Conservation and also the International Policy Lead for the Society for Ecological Restoration. And a co-author of this talk is Michelle Smith, who is a field biologist with IRC and has been helping out with the Pine Rockland Initiative for the last couple of years. I also want to give a shout out to Alex C. Schultz, who's been our crew leader for more than 6 months now and doing an awesome job in the field. So if you haven't met him, I hope you have an opportunity to do so soon. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so through this PowerPoint. And like Kara said, if you have questions or comments, just please use the chat box. And then we'll open it up for a conversation at the end. And thanks for being here. See lots of friends and colleagues. Some of you have seen versions of this talk numerous times. All right, so I want to start off with some acknowledgements. The Pine Rockland Initiative, like many of IRC's programs and resources, are the culmination of work by many people and institutions and collaborators. And so I just want to acknowledge that at the very beginning. That there's been a lot of people involved in the work and talking about these things. People have provided all kinds of resources, including imagery that we use in our presentations and on our website. And a lot of people have contributed funding or collaborated in various ways to the Pine Rockland Initiative. And just want to give a special thanks to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, both the partners and the coastal programs who've provided the bulk of the funding over the last 15 years. Very briefly, we're going to talk about IRC and our mission, the conservation context in South Florida. The Pine Rockland Initiative, of course, will be the bulk of the conversation, and then have time at the end for questions and comments. So if you're not familiar with IRC, we aim to protect, restore, and manage all biodiversity on a regional basis and to prevent local extinctions of native plants, animals, and ecosystems. So the idea here is that wherever we're working on, whatever group we're working on, in this case, South Florida and principally plants, our goal is to try and protect all the species of plants in South Florida. So not just the charismatic ones or the endemic ones or the interesting ones, but all plants. And what do we have to do that? As Kara mentioned, we've been around for about 35 years, and we have currently a staff of 13 research and conservation associates and 7 board members. We do a lot of activities that pertain to the Pine Rockland Initiative and other programs, including floristic and faunistic inventories and rare species research, education and outreach, and so forth. Just a quick look at some of our IRC resources. One of the things that we try and do is provide resources that we think will help people do a better job on the ground at no cost. So we try to find funding so that we can build tools like Natives for Your Neighborhood or Floristic Inventory of South Florida or other tools that people can use, whether that's just out of curiosity or for issues of science or conservation management. We try to get the information out there in a way that we think is useful. We have robust ecological restoration and community outreach programs, and we do have a professional crew, as I mentioned, but also we think it's really important when doing restoration work to involve the community. But as stakeholders, as volunteers, as peers, to try and build a network of supporters so that when we do work that it has some chance of persisting into the future and building and becoming better. And in the case of Pine Rocklands, this has been now a 15+ year haul, and there's some of you have been around for the whole thing and some of you are new, but this is for sure one of those things where we have to have community engagement and we have to have our aim on the long haul. We also do international policy work on ecological restoration, conservation, and sustainability. I had the honor of being the first author on the second edition of the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration that was launched last year. And so we try to bring global thinking into our work wherever that takes place, and we're doing so now in terms of our thinking about pine rockland restoration. So a brief context on South Florida conservation. So South Florida is part of the North America Coastal Plain Global Hotspot. So this is one of the areas that have been identified around the world that has a high concentration of endemic species, both plants and animals, and also has a large degree of habitat destruction or threat. So what's important here is that you'll see South Florida on the bottom is this gray color. So we don't exactly fit into the coastal plain floristic province, but we are part of the hotspot. And so we're kind of unique floristically and faunistically. And so this makes our work a little bit more challenging and also a little bit more interesting. From the perspective of floristics, we have this interface between south and northern range limits of species in South Florida. So we have plants like this Asclepias that is all over the eastern United States that makes it into South Florida but doesn't make it into the Caribbean. And similarly, we have tropical species like this cowhorn orchid that is primarily a tropical species that barely makes it into South Florida or into peninsular Florida. Mixed with that, we have endemic species. Some are endemic to South Florida, some very, very small parts of South Florida, and others are endemic in the state of Florida. And at present count, we have over 110 taxa that are endemic to Florida in one way or the other that are present in South Florida. And this particular species is primarily a pine rockland and marl prairie species, but you can see also some outlier populations. We also have widespread species like this black bog rush, which is more common in Europe than it is in the United States, but it is a native part of our flora. And if you're ever in the marl prairie at Martinez Pineland, you can see this species growing naturally. And it's the combination of all of these things together that makes South Florida interesting and makes our work interesting and important. So from the perspective of IRC, local biodiversity matters. So sure, we do care about the status of species within their entire global ranges, but we think that we also should be protecting all of the species within our local community, within our region. And so that is what we strive to do. And just to note that plant diversity is a key to animal biodiversity, starting with invertebrates and moving to birds and other animals in the food chain, but also vice versa. Without these invertebrates, we won't have the same plants in the landscape. Looking at the conservation system in South Florida, we have a very robust conservation system, and the measurement is over 50% of the region, excuse me, including some marine systems. And the global target for 2020 for the Convention on Biological Diversity is 17%. So we're way above any kind of global targets. And so it would be nice to think that because we're so far above all these global targets that everything should be fine. We should have all the species should be protected. Everything should have a home. All we have to do is worry about management and so forth. But that indeed is not the case. And the reason is because of this issue of proportionality, that some ecosystems or habitats are protected at a higher ratio than others, and certain ecosystems are poorly protected, as we will see. So in the case of pine rocklands, this is just a couple versions of a map that many of you are familiar with. And the idea is that this particular ecosystem, although it is protected on Long Pine Key, that this part on the Miami Rock Ridge outside of the Everglades is very poorly protected, and less than 2% of that original extent remains. So our great conservation system doesn't do a whole lot for the species that are dependent on this ecosystem in those areas. All right, so a little bit about pine rocklands. So pine rocklands are found on limestone substrate in South Florida and in the Bahamas. In the northern part of the Miami Rock Ridge, the limestone is mostly covered by sand. And in the south, the limestone is exposed in southern Miami-Dade County and in the Florida Keys, also places like the Bahamas. In the Redland, there are reddish clay-like soils, which are habitat for some species that only grow in those pockets. South Florida is the slash pine is the only canopy tree. There's a wide variety of shrubs and palms, both temperate and tropical origin, that are found in the understory. But it's the ground cover where all the action really is. This is where the biodiversity is, with dozens of species of grasses and wildflowers and vines and ferns and so forth. And importantly, pine rocklands evolve with and are dependent on fire. So without fire, things start going wrong pretty quickly. So we need fire, depending on where you are, every 3 to 5 or 7 years. And without that, soon other species begin to invade. And Pine Rocklands is a globally imperiled ecosystem with a large number of endemic plants and animals, including a number of species listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, the state of Florida, IRC, and others. I think at last count, I had 11, from some work that Jennifer Posey's been doing, 11 animals and 16 plants listed by the federal government. This is a slide that Jim Snyder put together on the distribution of pine rocklands in South Florida. And so the pine rocklands that we're going to be talking about are primarily in the lower Florida Keys and on the Miami Rock Ridge. Most of the remaining pine rocklands are on Long Pine Key and Everglades National Park, but as we're going to see, they're quite a bit different from most of the other pine rocklands. And then also, according to some authors, there are pine rocklands in the Big Cypress, and there are indeed areas with limestone outcrops that have many pine rockland species present there. All right, so this is a slide of the Miami Rock Ridge pinelands, and I just want to make this point about why different areas are important. So I took a look at the species that were present in these different parts of the Miami Rock Ridge. So off on the left, off of the screen, is Long Pine Key, and then most of the screen is the Biscayne pinelands, as described by John Kunkel Small and others. And so the Miami Rock Ridge, which is Long Pine Key plus the Biscayne pinelands, has about 420 taxa of native plants recorded. And if you look at the unique taxa, so if you said, okay, we can do, we've got pine rocklands protected in Everglades National Park, it's quite a bit of territory, that should take care of things. But if you look at the data, you find that that's actually not true. That Long Pine Key has only 4 taxa that are not found in other parts of the Miami Rock Ridge. But the Biscayne pinelands, in particular northern Biscayne, have a large number of species that are only found in the Biscayne pinelands. They're not protected in Everglades National Park, and this includes quite a number of endemic species. If we look back through time, on the Miami Rock Ridge, we can look at the large-scale clearing of pine rocklands. Began around the turn of the century in the 1910s and 20s, clearing for agriculture using fairly primitive means in the very beginning. But some areas like Coral Gables were fairly well beginning to be built out even in the early 1920s. But it's the invention of the rock plow, this is the patent illustration for the rock plow in 1943. The invention of the rock plow really changed things. This allowed for the breaking up of the limestone and the rapid destruction and conversion of pine rocklands to agricultural use in particular. So this is these are some data that I and some collaborators put together for a talk in 2018. And what we can see is that on the top part of the slide, that there's very little data about what happened to pine rocklands between 1900 and 1975. So pine rocklands had shrunk. Looking at the soils, data that were put together by the National Park Service, that the pine rocklands had shrunk from about 160,000 acres to a little over 5,000 acres between 1900 and 1975. So we were already pretty in pretty rough shape before anybody really started taking a close look. And then you can see conservation happens, and we start doing some things about it, but it's a little bit late. On the bottom part of the slide, I've tried to create fuzzy estimates of what this actually might have looked like, in terms of you might have had a more gradual destruction of pine rocklands in the beginning, and then you have the rock plow and massive urbanization after World War II. So you have the rapid fall off and loss of pine rocklands until we all woke up and realized we needed to do something about it. Just a point that I want to make, that that destruction of pine rocklands, as most of us know, is continuing, and there are not a lot of great options in terms of preventing that from happening, other than acquisition. But acquisition, of course, is a very important tool, and one that is continuing to be used by Miami-Dade County by the EEL program, and so forth. So the loss, just the loss of habitat, is still not over, but hopefully it will be soon. On Big Pine Key, kind of a similar thing going on. This is a nice slide. And the light green in the middle are the pine rocklands on Big Pine Key. And you can see the conversion over time and the fragmentation of pine rocklands there. But proportionally, there's more pine rocklands left on Big Pine Key than, say, on the Miami Rock Ridge. Similar to the mainland, you have the same kinds of threats: development, improper fire, exotic species, but you also have the addition of sea level rise, which incidentally will also affect Long Pine Key sooner than it will other parts of the Miami Rock Ridge. Some management challenges. So prescribed fire, if we don't have large intact ecosystems, then we need to introduce fire to the pinelands that remain. And just the bottom line is that there are never enough resources or support. So we're continuously losing ground in terms of getting fire on the landscape and maintaining pine rocklands as they should be. Doesn't mean that people aren't trying. If we don't have fire, then we have the expansion of native hardwoods and palms. And this is kind of the beginning stages, and later stages, of course, you can't even see the palms. It's basically all just hardwoods. One of the ironies of Hurricane Andrew was that on the Miami Rock Ridge, most of the pine trees died. So people worked very vigorously to replant or reseed pine trees. And in fact, we were a little too successful. So you have sites like this is Florida City Pineland, where the slash pine cover is just too high. So in the absence of fire or other treatments, the pine trees are basically shading out the understory and the ground cover. In terms of invasive species and also native vines, that these things are continuing to move. We have new species that come into pine rocklands all the time. And so it just adds to the complexity of the work. We're also experiencing species loss. So here are a few species that haven't been documented in pine rocklands for a long while, although they have been historically. And so we know that we have species that are dropping out of the system entirely. So things that were found, say, in the early 1900s, there are no modern records in any pine rockland. We know the habitat destruction causes most extinctions, especially in the early stages. Here are a couple of examples of the Veroni on the upper left, which was known from one site, which was developed for a school. And then on the lower right, so the one on the left is also widespread in the Bahamas and the West Indies, but just one population in Florida, now gone. And then the Tafrosi angustissima on the lower part of the slide was a global endemic known only from the Miami Rock Ridge over a fairly large area, but every known population of that plant has been lost. Over time, we know that fragmentation is going to lead to more losses. So no matter what we do, chopping things up into small pieces means that certain species are going to drop out. And so one of our challenges is to figure out how to minimize that loss, or maybe use restoration techniques to maintain higher levels of biodiversity in the patches that we have left. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Pine Rockland Initiative. So the Pine Rockland Initiative dates back to 2005, when we got some funding, in particular to help private owners of pine rocklands and the control of invasive species. Over time, the program has expanded so that we're doing work on public and private properties, and we're also doing a wider range of activities than just invasive species control. So this includes hardwood removal. In some cases, we've been able to do some fire, rare species work, ecological restoration design and outreach, and so forth. So it's more of a whole package in terms of trying to figure out how to work with collaborators to really move forward the restoration and conservation of pine rocklands. And as I mentioned, primary funding has come from Fish and Wildlife Service, and we've also had some key collaborators, including Miami-Dade County, Fairchild Tropical Garden, and others. Just real quick, we have currently some funding from Fish and Wildlife Service coastal program. We've been working since 2017 in a number of sites. So most of these are eel sites that we've been working on, just to give you an idea of the geography. And then also kind of in the middle, lower right, the Sock South project, which is a DoD project where we've been doing restoration of a pine rockland that was actually scraped, bulldozed and scraped, and a good portion of the site was turned into, had buildings on it and so forth. So it's a pretty interesting site to work on. This slide adds in some private sites, both sites that we're working on or will work on in the next few weeks, but also some areas where we've been able to give some technical advice, do some in-field consulting. This is just the recent batch of projects. We have a bigger group of sites that we've worked on since 2005. And then in the National Key Deer Refuge, we have a bunch of different work that's going on there, including hardwood reduction, invasive species control, the augmentation of Croton linearis, the host plant for a couple of endemic butterflies, mechanical hardwood reduction, and so forth. So we've got a lot of experience on the ground, and over the last couple of years, we've been working with colleagues to think about this from a bigger perspective. And so in May 2018, we got together, helped to organize the Expanding the Pine Rockland Footprint workshop, which was held at Fairchild with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Miami-Dade County, IRC, and Fairchild, where we started to talk about this idea that if we just keep going the way we're going, then ultimately the pine rocklands are just going to continue to degrade. We're going to keep losing parcels and so forth. So how do we kind of change the trajectory? How can we figure out how to stop the destruction and actually start doing restoration on a net basis, so we have more than we start with instead of less? And so this idea we took to the 2018 Pine Rockland Working Group Conference. Many of you on the call were there, where we kind of launched the idea of expanding the footprint, that we could actually have as a goal to do restoration on pine rockland patches that had been scraped or bulldozed or rock plowed, and previously we just really weren't paying attention to. We've also put a bit of effort into the work that private owners do, and we held the Private Pine Rockland Owners Summit in October 2018. We had a great group of people. We stayed in communication with many of them. And the idea was that pine rockland owners have done a huge amount of work over the decades, never have enough resources or technical support. And so we're trying to work with them to figure out what are their experiences, what do they need, and how can we help to the extent that we can. And one of the problems, of course, is that funding for our program has been inconsistent and scattered over time. And so is there a way to organize help for private owners of pine rocklands in a more organized way. And so this brings us to this idea of the Pine Rockland Business Plan. So this is kind of builds on conversations that Fish and Wildlife Service and IRC and Fairchild and Miami-Dade County and others have been having. And this initiative is being led by Fish and Wildlife Service and TNC. And the idea is to kind of bring together all of the information on pine rocklands in Miami-Dade County and the Florida Keys, and to figure out, what are our needs? How do we actually move the expanding the footprint idea forward? And then, how do we prioritize our actions given the fact that we never have enough resources? But the aim at the end of the day is to end up with more than what we started with, both in terms of the extent and the quality of the habitat. Stipulation about this whole process is that we can't fix everything, and we know that. So there are areas, for instance, in the Florida Keys where we're losing pine rocklands to sea level rise, and expanding the footprint and the Pine Rockland Business Plan are not going to fix that. So we just have to acknowledge that, but there's a lot we can do with what we have, and so we want to figure out the best ways of making that happen. So the idea is to develop, is to look at restoration opportunities. What opportunities do we have to restore both the extent, that's the idea of expanding the footprint, and the quality, that is the integrity of pine rocklands, including degraded or transitional pinelands. And some of these sites have not been counted. They're not part of the 3,000 or so acres that we count as pine rocklands. So can we bring some of those sites back into the fold and increase our acreage of quality pine rocklands? So the question is, what do we really have? What do we have to work with? And what do we want? And ultimately, we have to change the conversation about pine rocklands, about how it is that we can really move forward and restore and protect this resource. One of the things that we want to look at is our ideas of degradation versus destruction. So this is a case adjacent, a site adjacent to an IRC conservation area in Florida City. And so this was kind of a trashy site, but the owner came in and just obliterated everything. And so our old way of looking at this might be, it's just completely destroyed, and we should just write it off because it has no value. But that might not be the best way of looking at it. In fact, this owner may have unwittingly helped move things forward by removing Brazilian pepper and other invasive species, and there might be good stuff in the understory that could respond to this clearing. So maybe when things look like they're terrible, there's still an opportunity to turn things around and make something positive out of it. We know that there are these sites that have been scraped for a long period of time, and so these are great sites to work with. So this is, the Richmond Pine Rocklands, the Coast Guard facility in particular, has acres and acres and acres that are covered with pine rockland grasses and herbs, endemic species, listed species, and so forth. But historically weren't counted as pine rocklands because the substrate had been, the whole ecosystem had been removed, and all that remained was kind of a flattened substrate. But in fact, most of the species were still there. Similarly, in the Florida Keys, there's areas that are pretty high quality that people may not recognize, but have in fact been scraped. They might be old home sites or places where equipment were stored or et cetera. And so there are some opportunities to work with these areas to kind of move the restoration forward and get full ecosystem recovery. We have these transitional pinelands. Some of these, for instance, in the covenant process in Miami-Dade County, are legally called transitional. They're fire suppressed. And historically, we might have just said, okay, we're not going to worry about that. They're too far gone. We can't, they can't be restored and so forth. But we can't think like that. We can, in fact, go in and remove hardwoods. We can restore the understory and the ground cover of these sites. And so we need to look at them as potential for restoration. And then moving on to the areas that are just, they are really awful. They have rock plowed soils or other kinds of degradation. They're just basically masses of exotic species, although you can see even a tetrazygia hanging on here. But these are all places where we could do pine rockland restoration that can help us to expand the footprint. But how do we do that? So this brings us to the proof of concept. And so the first thing is that we know when we really look at the information that's available to us that pine rocklands are actually pretty resilient. So this slide is of a site in Redland that that was cleared around 1970 or earlier. I used to ride my bike by this site. My dad remembers this site. We've been watching this site for decades. And yes, there are some invasive grasses in there and some other species, but it's really interesting that the pine rockland understory, then the ground cover layer is still there. So there's still pine rockland forbs and grasses, including endemics, that are hanging on these places 50 years after they were, quote, destroyed. We also know that places like fire breaks in Everglades National Park, so they were cleared decades ago. And so the thinking that we can't restore scraped pine rocklands, cleared pine rocklands, or things like that just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because we have evidence that's right in front of us that in fact much of the pine rockland vegetation can do just fine in these areas. And then we're going to have a growing body of evidence from we're doing at Sock South and other former scrape sites that, in fact, if we do things the right way, that pine rockland vegetation will recover and we can get a high degree of species diversity, including endemics and so forth. We also have the example of the hole in the donut in Everglades National Park. So this is primarily a wetland restoration project. It's rock plowed soils, industrially farmed with high levels of chemicals and so forth. And the idea is to remove the Asian recovery, which is happening. And some of the areas where this is occurring include fingers of pine rocklands that would have gone down into the hole in the donut. So we have evidence there that even rock plowed, industrially farmed soils can be restored. We have to acknowledge, though, that that water plays an important role in what happens there. And so in terms of both suppression of weeds, but also in dispersal of propules, that it may be harder outside of Everglades National Park, but at least we have evidence that it is possible. There's also all kinds of projects that have been going on in the Miami Rock Ridge. This is an example of a direct seeding experiment or trial at Nixon Smiley Pineland, where people are trialing different techniques. There are outplanting projects like this one at Zoo Miami, all kinds of different ones that have taken place over long periods of time, where we can look and see what went right, what went wrong, what can we learn from these various things. We also have restoration of micro pinelands in the urban zone. So Connect to Protect by Fairchild has done a great job of promoting this idea. IRC's Natives for Your Neighborhood also provides information that helps people to do that. But the reality is that we have hundreds of sites as part of Connect to Protect that that somebody has their mic on. That provide us with a lot of learning about what we can do to restore pine rocklands in these very disturbed and fragmented areas. We've been developing new tools and thinking about pine rockland restoration. So literally for decades, the idea was, we can't use machinery. Again, if there's been any kind of substrate disturbance, whether it's scraping or rock plowing, that all bets are off and we can't do restoration. And as we just described, that seems to not be the case. And so, this idea of using the skid steer with the forestry mulch is something that was trialed in the Florida Keys. We did some of that work on Big Pine Key. And then we had an area at Sock South where we said, let's try this machine there. And so we did. We're also using other kinds of mowing machines like this brush cutter to work in weedy areas to see if that will in fact help. So these things are not replacements for fire. We still need fire, but in certain cases like these, fire never would have carried through these areas anyway. There was just nothing to carry the fuel. So, so we need to look at these and other kinds of techniques to figure out if we can move the process forward. And we have evidence that that Pine Rockland species, including some very rare ones and listed ones, this is federally endangered, Small's milkpea, and a couple of examples in that hardwood reduction area where we use a forestry mulcher. So that's about 2 meters of tape on the left, 2 plants of Galactia smallii that just exploded after we removed the hardwood cover. And then we're actually getting recruitment of Galactia smallii in these highly organic areas where we've chopped up the debris. So we know that there can be some positive responses. We're also getting great responses from weeds and things that need to be dealt with. But this gives us an indication that this technique can work. So I just wanted to provide some kind of a sequence of photos of the work at Soxow. So this is about 1.5 years. So this is a former scrape site. In part of the site were buildings. There's still existing parking lots. And this is an area where the original intent was to remove exotics and reintroduce fire, but because of the proximity to the Homestead Air Reserve Base airfield, that never happened. So after the invasive species were removed, we had a huge blow up of poisonwood and other hardwoods. So this is part of the area where we use the forestry mulcher. So just to give you an idea, even over 1.5 years of using the mechanized treatment, following up with the billy goat and all sorts of handwork, by the lower right hand in January 2020, the native understory and ground cover is doing great, and the process is moving along quite well. We've also been looking at direct seeding trials and also this idea of applied nucleation. So we know that if we're going to restore these highly degraded pine rocklands and we can't use water, that we're going to have to control weeds. And weeds are our biggest enemy in this particular context. How do we get the native ground cover reestablished? So we've set up these trials, direct seeding trials for native grasses. This is about a 1 meter square area where we tried 5 different grasses or grass mixes. And on the right is 1 year later, and all of those lines have now grown into each other. So what we're doing now is pulling back the organic material from this little cell, and we're starting to get recruitment of these native grasses outside. So the idea is, one of the things that we've learned is that in some of the earlier outplanting efforts, where we have planted pine trees and saw palmettos on 8-foot centers or 5-foot centers or 10-foot centers, doesn't really matter. We can't use machines to keep the weeds down. So those sites have to be hand weeded, or you have to use a weed eater or something else. So can we do this differently? Can we organize pine trees and palmettos and some of the shrubby understory plants into these islands, and then use mowing to suppress weeds while those areas are getting going, and then slowly expand out the islands of native vegetation? So this builds on this idea of applied nucleation and restoration ecology, which normally uses wildlife to use these islands to attract wildlife, which then spread seeds. But in our case, most of these are going to be, some will be wildlife dispersed, but in the case of the grasses, they're wind dispersed. But the idea is it would be incredibly costly. It would be very difficult to manage. But if we want to do hundreds or thousands of acres of pine rockland restoration, how can we do this efficiently and keep costs down? So these are some ideas of how we might be able to do that. Ultimately, we have to deal with this issue of targets and reference models. We have all kinds of information about pine rocklands, but if we're going to do restoration, what is the ultimate aim? What should the different ecological attributes be like? And we've been working with partners to try and figure this out, from what should the density and cover of pine trees be, to palms and hardwoods and so forth. And so we're putting this into some models and into some matrices having great conversations about that, and ultimately we'll start putting these things out there to trial. And so some of this work builds on work that Jennifer Posley and others did for the Richmond Pine Rocklands, and some other earlier work, and work that IRC has been doing in parallel, coming up with species matrices to give targets in restoration. Hopefully you can't see that. And so the idea is to develop actual reference models that we can then have as targets and test over time. And so we're beginning to populate. So this is a recovery wheel that is part of the SER standards, and so this allows us to look at 6 major attributes of ecosystems and let us know, let us determine where are we starting from, where are we trying to get to, and these wheels are very helpful because in some cases, like in the Miami Rock Ridge, we're not ever going to have really excellent connectivity, and we know that. We're not going to have major predators, but we can do a lot of things. So we want to identify what are the things that we can do and aim for those. At the end of the day, we have a choice, in our opinion, and that is that we can do business as usual. We can continue to slowly see pine rocklands become degraded, to not get fire on the ground, to see invasive species take over, and to see habitat loss just through clearing and so forth. Or we can change the plan. We can create a new business plan, so to speak, to expand the footprint and to increase the quality of pine rocklands throughout the range. And that is it for the presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it. And now I will pass the baton back to Kara. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Thank you.
There we go.
It's raining so hard here, so I turned my mic off. At this point, if you have any questions, go ahead and put those into the chat box and we'll get them asked to George. We already do have at least one. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. It says, how does the field cutting affect the invasive weeds? So that came through the slide before the planting slide that you had.
So the field cutting, you mean the mechanized cutting?
I believe so.
Yeah, yeah. So so what it seems to mostly impact are weeds of any ilk. So it doesn't really make things, it doesn't really help or hurt things like Brazilian pepper or things like that, even Neuralia. But there's an explosion of weeds, especially with the high organic content. But one of the interesting things has been that it's not worse than doing the cutting and having the mulch on the ground has not turned out to be worse in the beginning, in the early stages, than bare ground. So if you just said, okay, I'm gonna scrape that site, which would be more costly, and then you would have debris to deal with and so forth. What we found in some pine rocklands and other areas that you can get more weeds more quickly using that kind of treatment. So we're interested in finding out whether or not we can use these kind of chopping, not chopping the soil, like roller chopping, for instance, but chopping of the vegetation, letting it fall on the ground, letting it decompose and oxidize over time. Can we kind of keep the weeds at bay long enough to get these islands of native vegetation established that can then spread? The question then becomes, if the organic material doesn't break down quickly enough, like you saw in the one where we're actually having to physically move it to the side, how do we do that? And how do we do that efficiently? So that's something we're still wrestling with.
Great. And from the same person, is there a program similar to the Pineland Rock Forest for the coastal pine forest, and specifically efforts in Boca Raton at Sugar Sand Park, Blazing Star, and Yamato Scrub as well as areas in Deerfield and Delray.
Right. So we've talked about this. So we have the Pine Rockland Initiative in Pine Rocklands, and we have the Restoring the Gold Coast working on the barrier islands. And the question of how to create a consortium of interested partners to work on these other uplands in North Dade and Broward and Palm Beach, scrubby flatwoods, even Music flatwoods at this point. In that urban corridor are incredibly rare. Whether it doesn't matter whether you're in Broward or South Palm Beach County. Until you get to North Palm Beach County, the percentage of remaining habitat is incredibly low. In some cases, lower than in Miami-Dade County. So we would love to partner on this idea of creating an initiative to work on those other very rare upland ecosystems. So I'm all ears. Send me a note. Let's talk.
Great. Somebody else asked, going back to the slide with the 2 workers doing direct seed, why not do a small low intensity burn to reduce some of that low mulch?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So we can't even do micro burns at that location. So that's at Stock South, which is immediately adjacent to the Homestead Air Reserve base. But the Glancies and others have looked at using little propane burners, and other people have too. And Miami-Dade County, actually this ending slide here is of Pine Shore, where in a highly urbanized area where they burn a quarter of the site. So if we scale that, if we say, okay, can we use fire at a very low scale? We should do that. I think that's great. If we can figure out the logistics. Miami-Dade County's work with burn boxes around rare species and such. But the logistics and the cost of doing that are, I think, going to be too high. So even if you had a microburn, the amount of effort and permits and all of that stuff are just really costly. So the idea is, can we figure out a way to move things a little bit further along through natural processes like oxidation, using rainfall to push carbon into past the soil surface into the groundwater and such, so that we can then get these grassy ecosystem processes going that ultimately can carry fire. The ultimate aim shouldn't be mechanical. The ultimate aim should be to be able to reintroduce fire into these systems and use it to the extent that we can. But there will be circumstances where that's going to be difficult.
Great. Yeah, we have several more questions coming through. One said, when discussing the hole in the donut, you mentioned that hydrology would have different effects in the Everglades. Can you elaborate on the effects of hydrology on Pine Rockland restoration inside versus outside of the park?
Right. So the fact that the hole in the donut floods every summer is really important. So if you look back at farming in Miami-Dade County to the pre-World War II era, the farming was done in the Marl Prairies. And one of the reasons why farming was done in the Marl Prairies was because summer flooding killed weeds. And so this happens also in places like the hole in the donut. It's not perfect. There are plenty of weeds that like wet areas, but there are way more weeds that like upland agricultural soils. So the fact that the hole in the donut floods has 2 very positive effects. It suppresses weeds, and it moves propagules of native plants around quite effectively. So the problem outside of Everglades National Park, where the water table is lower and you're not going to have any kind of flooding, is that we're going to have to contend with all sorts of agricultural weeds that will not be suppressed by any kind of flooding. But we also have the problem of dispersal. How will we get all of those seeds out on the landscape in a way that they are going to actually want to grow? And this is what we have to figure out. In addition to all of that, if you look at targets, so and if we have a reference model, the water table, even outside of Everglades National Park would have historically been much closer to the surface. And in cases, there would have been flooding. Many of the pine rocklands outside of Everglades National Park would have had very short-term flooding or longer periods if they were adjacent to transverse glades or marl prairies. And so the fact that we don't have that flooding is going to ultimately affect species composition. We already have wetland species, whether they're bay trees or willow or other things that used to be found in pine rocklands outside of Everglades National Park that are falling out of the system. So we need to understand that that's going to happen, that part of the loss of species due to fragmentation is going to be due to these changes in hydrology. And we can't expect to have the exact same species pool. So in terms of looking at targets for restoration and what we should aim for and what we can expect, we have to take these kinds of regional changes, like regional changes in hydrology, specifically the drop in the water table, is going to have an influence on the species composition. So when we're doing restoration, we also have to take this into account. So some things that might seem obvious, oh, well, we should use, muley grass or something outside of Everglades National Park, may not be the best choice because it may be just too dry for them to be able to be used in mass. There may be other species that are more appropriate in terms of establishing that grassy ground cover.
Great. Would efforts to plant natives in developed areas in the ridge help these efforts? For example, Pinecrest and other new cities have large properties that can be supplemented with a guide similar to your gardening on the barrier islands. This would help chaining species and help with long-term recovery.
Right. So I think, the work that we've done with Natives for Your Neighborhood and the work that Fairchild's done with Connect to Protect and then a lot of other local initiatives show that we can restore a lot of biodiversity in the urban zone. The thing that I find intriguing about these larger properties is how do we do this in a way that isn't going to negatively affect aesthetics and costs associated with maintenance and such. So this is why, I started thinking about this idea of we need to plant pine rockland vegetation in a way, in these islands, for instance, in a way that is going to limit the liability for maintenance. Because if there's a maintenance liability or if it's more work, then maybe the work doesn't get done. And if the work doesn't get done, then maybe it turns into a giant mess. And if it turns into a giant mess, then nobody's going to want to do that, right? Legitimately, people are going to say, well, I don't want to support pine rockland planting in my city because look at the city down the block and they have one and it's a mess. So I think we do need to think really carefully about what we can do in a way that can get social acceptance, can be aesthetically beautiful, can have low, maintenance costs or implications. And so that's why, one of the reasons why I'm interested in this kind of combination of planting and mowing, because if you have large areas, you could plant islands of pines and palmettos and coonties and shrubs and things, but you could also, there's an awful lot of grassy mowed areas right now that could have a really high diversity of pine rockland, herbaceous and grassy material that nobody would object to because you could mow it on a regular basis. No, it's not full restoration. It doesn't need to be. But it could really help in terms of helping with connectivity, providing a habitat for pollinators and invertebrates and then birds and so forth. But I think that we need to talk about and think about a design concept that will really work.
Great. Barbara says, is there ex-situ conservation strategies of rockland endemics? And if so, how many species or roughly what proportion and what kind of species?
All right, so the ex-situ work is primarily being done by Fairchild. So I saw Jennifer Posley and Lydia were on the call earlier, or on the webinar earlier, and they could respond to that. But So our work at IRC, we've done some XE2 work, but our work I see is on the end of restoration and floristics, looking at it from more of a systems approach. I can't tell you the number of species that Fairchild has been working with. If Jennifer or Lydia is on the still got their chat thing going, maybe they can give us an answer over the chat box. But it's a lot. I think we know a lot about Pine Rockland endemics and also non-endemic species, and how to grow them, and how they work, and so forth. No takers on that, huh?
Oh, there we go. Jennifer says over 60 species, probably more.
Yep. Yeah, so it's a large number. Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. All right, anything else? I think we're winding to the hour. It is, oh yeah, it's 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
All right, folks, I'm gonna have to run. Thank you for being here and hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I'm gonna put my email address in the chat bar. So if there was a question you didn't get a chance to type or anything else, feel free to reach out to me after the fact. I'm gonna put that in there right now. And we'll be posting this webinar online. If you had anyone who wanted to join today but couldn't, we'll have a YouTube link for it soon. Many strategies for seed bank. Thanks, Lydia. Yep. Oh, great. Glancy's were here. Yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone. We're glad you were able to come out this Tuesday afternoon. Awesome. And I see the message from Michael. If you're still on here, I will definitely reach out to you after this. Thank you. Well, have a great afternoon, everyone.